Hi, and welcome to Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock are reflecting on what it means to be an educated person in theology, the importance of soft skills, and the limitations of social media.
A lot of that is much easier as well. So it's interesting. I've never used it. Interesting.
Yeah. So it's pretty exciting to think about. Also, there's been a lot of interesting sort of developments in current events in the news and maybe theologically in the theological part of current events. And so I thought maybe if it sounded good to you, Chuck, we could try to just take a stab at being pundits speaking about the recent events of the day, at least to the degree that it makes sense. You and I are obviously talking so much about somebody's material that's already written down, maybe gone through a curation process, an aging process, and we actually might want to talk about that a little bit because I think it's important. One of the enemies to the student of good theology is bad curation. If you come and ask me what are the directions to downtown and I lead you astray and you start driving in the wrong direction, it might be quite a long while until you recognize that's happened, if in fact you do. And so that's what I think happens with students of theology, people who make it a priority to try to study the scriptures and the related interplay in society, interacting apologetically with believers and non-believers. And it's so easy to get pulled into a wild goose chase and pulled into something that's not edifying. And if you're not careful, you might invest a lot of time and effort and energy and put a lot of your stock in theology in a principle. So, for example, take the principle that churches must have sand-colored carpeting. That's, of course, a silly principle. There's no doctrine that I know of that says that, but let's pretend there was. You have, and by the way, it's not hard to pretend in the sense that there are actual congregations who have fought and split over the color of the carpeting in the sanctuary. And so the point there is not to belittle, but to say it's easy to major in the minors. And so I just wanted to check in with you about one or two things on that and see what your thoughts were, because I'm sure you have it but from maybe a slightly different angle, given your reading patterns over the years and how you've come to things. So I just wanted to open that up if that sounded okay.
Sounds great. Yeah. Let's talk about current events. And yeah, sounds good.
So on the way to current events, Chuck, what's your strategy to become highly educated or trained in theological matters? The ability to speak to most, not all, theological situations. I think one of the first things that's worth acknowledging, when I first started my theological training, I thought naively that I could major in all of it. And even from the very beginning, it became clear that some degree of specialization is needed. And if somebody thinks they're going to be, let's say, highly trained or a top-notch specialist in all of the areas of theology, that sure is a tall order. And what did you think about when you purposed to study these things, to be more edified in the growth and nurture of the Lord?
Yeah, interestingly, I think when I really first started doing a lot of theological study purposely, more than just occasionally reading a book or some other reading material, was the result of I had been in some Bible studies and some things like that, and I was just looking for something deeper. And in my denomination, the Christian Reformed Church in North America, there is a program called the Leadership Development, and each regional body of churches has been tasked with creating a leadership development. And it was originally created out of the idea of trying to develop folks who would be church planters. But every classis was given a little bit of leeway as to how they wanted to handle that. And when I first heard about our Classis Wisconsin Leadership Development Network, it had been started in conjunction with a couple of our Illinois classes, Chicago South, I think, maybe Illiana as well, with Indiana classes in the Chicago area. And it had started, in fact, as a church planter network. But as it got really large and the decision was to have each classes separate out and do its own thing, and they were looking for people in Wisconsin, the recognition is that just focusing on church planting in Wisconsin might not be enough to get people. And so they focused on it more as just a, hey, we're going to go a little more in depth than what you normally do in a Bible study. We're going to study some theology, we're going to study some scripture, and we're going to study some church history. And it sounded interesting to me. It was a 3-year course where once a month after we'd have assignments and then we'd meet once a month. So I joined that, and I really appreciated that 3-year structure. We spent a year primarily focused on a study of scripture as a whole. We went through the whole Old Testament, New Testament. We spent a year on theology, Reformed theology. We actually used Burkhoff for that. And then the year on church history was partly church history, but then it also got into some of the practicalities of ministry. And as a result of that, I really enjoyed it. And I realized that for me, I recognized pretty quickly that I was unlikely to ever become an expert on some very narrow area study. That what my goal really was to learn more in depth about a broad range of items, recognizing that there would always be people in every area that would have more in-depth knowledge. So a lot of what we were learning is how to read and how to look for experts and to have a base of knowledge. And so after I completed that, and that's when I got licensed to preach in my classes, I have purposely then in my reading tried to maintain a similar kind of structure where what I'm doing is spending in my sort of religious or theological reading, spending about a third of it on really theological kind of stuff, whether it's reading systematic theology, whether it's reading some specific theological issues, spending about a third of it on really scriptural kind of stuff, whether it's an actual Bible study or textual study, or whether it's other types of writings that really get at a biblical theology more than a systematic theology. And then the other third on really practical. I do enjoy church history. I enjoy learning some of the things that are going on in the world of the church. So it's that last third is a mix of different things. But I do try to maintain that by usually having something going from one of those categories and then moving on to another category. And it's got multiple books that I'm reading, but purposely trying to have at least one thread of my reading be in. And then in addition to that, finding place to have discussion. Iron sharpens iron concept. So whether that was when you first were out there looking for people to read through Reformed Ethics by Bavinck, I was like, hey, this is great. This is exactly what I was looking for. Or whether it's some of my other group of guys that I read with, and they tend to do some of the more practical stuff. We recently did one on religious freedom. And then I have another group that's focused a little bit more on some of the biblical theology kind of stuff, although it does sometimes vary a little bit. So yeah, so I've got these different groups of people that I meet with and read things together with them. And that's how I've really, and I do because I am a reading oriented person, but I also am people oriented. I like to discuss. That's recognizing that in myself. I felt that what I really need to do is make sure that I'm constantly reading and scheduling myself to do reading and do good reading. Otherwise, I'd end up reading through novels all the time. And then, but also finding opportunities to then share that reading with people, talk to people who are interested in those same issues and are reading a similar thing. And that's been a good thing. I think I'm in maybe 5 or 6 different book clubs right now, and only one of them a fiction book club. The rest of them is where I'm reading a lot of this theological or philosophical related to theological issues reading. That's been my strategy. How about you?
I love that summarization because when a musician learns to play an instrument, or perhaps a vocalist learns to sing, scales, singing a major scale, singing a minor scale, singing the variations of different sort of etudes or exercises to strengthen the voice, develop the embouchure if you're a wind, play a wind instrument, or etudes to develop your chops, your finger technique if you're a string player, whatever it is. Theology, getting better at it in a determined sense, is much the same. What fills the gaps there? And that, I agree with you that it comes down to a love of reading. There are places for other types of media, other ways to learn about theology and interact. So I don't want to just make it a hard and fast, if you don't read X amount of pages per day, you can't be in the club. I don't want to make it sound like that. But by and large, the material you're going to need to engage with primarily written. And so a love of reading is really a great start there. And for folks who do not have a love of reading, and not everybody needs to have a love of reading, just not everybody needs to want to play scales all the time. But if you're gonna develop some skill in the craft, I think you'll find it's necessary. And then there's an interesting bifurcation here. And I would say this: some people are introverted and other people are extroverted. And perhaps all of us are, to a degree, a mixture of both. So maybe some people are more introverted than they are extroverted, and while others, it's the opposite. The other thing you touched on was the situation with getting involved with book clubs with other people. Iron sharpens iron, people interacting with other people. If you're going to progress very far in theology, you absolutely need that connection with others. Traditionally, it's been your classmates at seminary, if you've attended a seminary. And if you haven't, you need some other way, because very quickly, if theology is left to yourself, you're going to have some difficulty. And it's not an impossible situation to go through. I myself am largely autodidactic, is the technical term, self-taught, self-engaged. But there's a qualitative difference. And I think one of the, if you had your life to live over again, what would you do differently? Items for me, I would hardly change anything, but I think I would have gone to seminary, either as a graduate for graduate studies or just decided as an undergraduate to do that. And because people who have made that career choice can reach heights of learning that are just, it's the juicy marrow that we all strive for. And yes, there's room for the plowman reading his scriptures, even though he's a farmer or an everyman. And the Reformation is built upon that. But there's also a desire to have more. And so a love of reading. And then you have to maybe plant yourself in a specific soil for the first few years. So you have to build your theology before you can then defend it. But you need to defend it as you're building it. Otherwise, you're going to build something that's not going to withstand even cursory kinds of criticism. And so this is perfect. Iron sharpens iron. And what you said that was so meaningful, Chuck, was that your days of training centered around Bavinck's systematic theology. And I think that's been a beautiful work that has blessed so many in your generation and my generation. The purple pill is what my friends and I jokingly referred to that book. And maybe yours isn't Berkhoff, maybe yours is another. But the point is you need that anchor point, you need that foundation. Of course, you need the scriptures, and I'm not saying that the scriptures are inadequate, but I'm also saying the people who are unable to learn from others are missing out on some of their best chances for learning theology in the most efficient fashion possible. And that's what you need to have theological discussions at a high level. It just takes a lot of training. I've been working at it now for about 20 years, and I think probably 5 to 7 years is a minimum of investment. Think of it as a part-time job that you go to almost every day, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, perhaps, and do that every day for 5 to 7 years before you even want to go out in public, maybe, let's say, in a non-nurturing place outside of your creche of your local church or your local Sunday school or your local university class, and say things in public that you might regret saying later, because really there's a lot to learn there. The sciences can be very tricky. I did well in math, Chuck, but that's largely because I could spot patterns very easily and efficiently. The subjects that I had the hardest time doing well in were subjects like biology or chemistry or history, because there the patterns there weren't so many patterns. You just had to really learn a lot of material and spend a lot of time. If it's history, you can't just learn a master pattern. You have to go through and learn about each of these important ages. If it's biology, you've got to learn the organic compounds, the different classes of them and how they interact with each other at high levels. The same thing with chemistry. You've got to learn how inorganic materials interact with each other, and there's just no easy pattern that gets you out of that. So that investment is really wise. The people who I encounter who still make me wince after all of these years are the folks who didn't want to do the reading and didn't want to invest that amount of time. And at some point, it does show. So that's where that comes out there.